I'm Rebecca, 27, and when my parents casually announced at Sunday dinner that my sister Zoe would just stay at my place for a while after her latest financial disaster, they all laughed like it was the most natural thing in the world. That's when I stood up and said, "Funny, I haven't agreed to that," and watched their smug expressions crumble as they realized their golden child safety net wasn't guaranteed this time. What they didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this exact moment for months, documenting every time they'd volunteered my resources without my consent, and the ultimatum I was about to deliver would expose years of financial enabling and force them to choose between continuing to coddle Zoe or maintaining a relationship with the daughter who actually had her life together. Before we dive into how I turned my family's assumptions about my automatic compliance into the most uncomfortable family meeting they never saw coming, I'm curious. Have you ever had family members just decide you'd solve their problems without bothering to ask your permission first? Drop your stories about being voluntold for family obligations in the comments below, smash that like button, and subscribe because this confrontation about boundaries and family responsibility has more explosive moments than a reality show finale, and trust me, you won't believe how my parents reacted when I finally said no to being the family cleanup crew. Growing up as the responsible older sister meant watching Zoe glide through life making increasingly poor decisions while our parents, David and Linda, consistently cushioned every fall with money, housing, and emotional support that never came with consequences or expectations for change. Zoe was 2 years younger but had never learned the connection between choices and outcomes because our parents had always stepped in to prevent her from experiencing the natural results of her behavior. Dropped out of college twice? Dad paid the tuition refunds and found her better opportunities. Got fired from 3 jobs in a row for attendance issues? Mom helped her create a resume that made the terminations look like career advancement. Evicted from 2 apartments for not paying rent? The family rallied to find her new places to live and co-signed leases she'd eventually default on. Meanwhile, I'd worked through college, graduated with honors, built a successful career in project management, and purchased my own condo by age 25. My achievements were acknowledged with polite pride, but they were also treated as evidence that I could handle my own problems and therefore didn't need the same level of family support that Zoe required. The expectation that I would serve as Zoe's safety net had been building for years through a series of increasingly presumptuous family decisions made without consulting me. When Zoe needed a place to stay after her first eviction, our parents had simply informed me that she'd be sleeping on my couch for a few weeks. When she needed money for a security deposit on a new apartment, I'd been volunteered to provide it before anyone asked if I was willing or able to help. Each time, the family pressure to comply was enormous. Refusing to help Zoe was framed as selfish, unloving, and a betrayal of family solidarity. "She's your sister," became the standard response to any hesitation about providing financial or housing assistance. "Family helps family," was the guilt trip deployed whenever I questioned why my resources were automatically considered available for Zoe's problems. The pattern had reached its breaking point 6 months earlier when Zoe had moved in with me temporarily after losing another job and apartment, then proceeded to treat my home like a free hotel while making no effort to find employment or contribute to household expenses. What was supposed to be a 2-week stay had stretched to 4 months of me supporting an adult woman who spent her days sleeping until noon, using my streaming services, and eating food I'd purchased while complaining that I didn't have enough variety in my pantry. When I'd finally insisted that Zoe needed to find her own place, our parents had been horrified by my lack of compassion and had guilted me into letting her stay longer while they helped her get back on her feet. The additional help had consisted of giving Zoe spending money and emotional support while she continued to make no effort toward independence. I'd eventually had to issue Zoe a formal 30-day notice to vacate my condo, which had resulted in a family crisis where I was painted as the cruel sister who was abandoning Zoe in her time of need. The fact that I'd already housed and financially supported her for 4 months was irrelevant compared to the family narrative that I should continue providing assistance until Zoe magically became responsible. Since Zoe had moved back in with our parents 6 weeks ago, I'd been enjoying the peace and privacy of having my own space back. My utility bills had decreased, my food budget had returned to normal, and I could actually relax in my own home without walking on eggshells around a houseguest who treated my hospitality like an entitlement. But I'd also been watching Zoe's behavior during family gatherings and documenting the ways our parents continued to enable her irresponsibility while expecting me to serve as backup support whenever their own resources or patience ran thin. The Sunday dinner announcement that Zoe would just stay at my place for a while was presented like a fait accompli, as if my consent was assumed and my resources were available by default whenever the family needed to solve Zoe's latest crisis. What they didn't realize was that I'd been preparing for exactly this moment, the inevitable attempt to volunteer me into solving another problem Zoe had created through her own choices, presented as a family obligation I couldn't refuse without being labeled selfish and uncaring. This time, I was ready with boundaries, documentation, and consequences that would force our parents to confront their enabling patterns and make actual parenting decisions instead of outsourcing Zoe's consequences to me. Sunday dinner at my parents' house had always been a command performance disguised as family bonding time. Everyone was expected to attend, contribute to meal preparation, and participate in conversations that usually centered around Zoe's latest drama and the family's collective efforts to solve problems she'd created for herself. This particular Sunday, I'd arrived to find Zoe looking unusually subdued, which was my first clue that another crisis was brewing. She'd been living with our parents for 6 weeks since I'd required her to move out of my condo, and the arrangement was clearly straining everyone involved. Zoe's been having some challenges with her living situation, Mom announced as we sat down to dinner, her voice carrying that diplomatic tone she used when discussing Zoe's problems with the family. "What kind of challenges?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "Well, you know how small our house is," Dad said, cutting into his pot roast with unnecessary force. "And Zoe's been looking for employment opportunities that would allow her to get back on her feet financially." The euphemisms were impressive. Small house meant that our parents were tired of having their 30-year-old daughter living in their basement like a teenager. Looking for employment opportunities meant that Zoe had been sleeping until noon and scrolling through social media instead of actually applying for jobs. "It's been really hard to job hunt when I don't have my own space for privacy during phone interviews," Zoe added, her voice carrying a tone of victimized innocence that suggested her unemployment was due to inadequate accommodations rather than her own lack of effort. I could see where this conversation was heading, but I wanted to hear them actually say it instead of dancing around the request with diplomatic language. "So what's the solution to these challenges?" I asked. Mom and Dad exchanged a look that suggested they'd already discussed this solution and were presenting it as the obvious answer to Zoe's problems. "Well, we thought Zoe could stay with you for a while," Mom said, her tone suggesting this was a reasonable request rather than a major imposition on my life and finances. "Just until she finds a good job and can afford her own place again." The phrasing was careful and manipulative. "Stay with you for a while" made it sound temporary and minimal. "Until she finds a good job" created an undefined timeline that could stretch indefinitely based on Zoe's standards for acceptable employment. "Rebecca's condo has that extra bedroom," Dad added, as if my spare bedroom existed specifically to solve family housing problems. "And it would give Zoe the privacy she needs to focus on her job search." The assumption that my private space was available for family use without my consent was breathtaking, but it was also exactly the kind of presumption I'd been expecting and preparing for. "Plus, you two always got along so well when you lived together before," Mom said, rewriting history to make my previous experience housing Zoe sound positive rather than the stressful, expensive ordeal it had actually been. That's when Zoe chimed in with her own contribution to the family pressure campaign. "I promise I'll be a better housemate this time, Becca," she said, using the childhood nickname that was supposed to evoke sisterly affection and family loyalty. "I've learned a lot about being more considerate, and I'll contribute to household expenses as soon as I start earning income." The promises were identical to the ones she'd made 6 months earlier, before proceeding to treat my home like a free hotel while making no effort toward financial contribution or independence. But the most telling part of the conversation was how all three of them were discussing this arrangement as if it were already decided. They weren't asking for my opinion or permission, they were informing me of the family solution to Zoe's problems and expecting me to comply with their decision. That's when they made the crucial mistake that gave me the perfect opening to establish boundaries and force them to confront their enabling patterns. "It'll be great having you two living together again," Mom said with a smile that suggested she genuinely believed this arrangement would be beneficial for everyone involved. Sisters supporting each other through difficult times, that's what family is all about. Dad laughed and nodded in agreement. "Zoe can stay at Rebecca's place for a while, and everyone benefits. Zoe gets the space she needs to job hunt effectively, Rebecca gets to help her sister succeed, and Linda and I get our house back to normal." The casual way they laughed about volunteering my home and resources without my consent was exactly the evidence I needed to deliver the confrontation I'd been preparing for months. The laughter around the dinner table stopped abruptly when I stood up from my chair, my movement deliberate and commanding enough to shift everyone's attention to me. "Funny," I said, my voice calm but carrying an edge that made it clear something significant was about to happen. "I haven't agreed to that." The silence that followed was profound. Mom's smile froze on her face, Dad's fork stopped midway to his mouth, and Zoe's eyes widened as she processed that her automatic safety net might not be available this time. "What do you mean?" Mom asked, her voice carrying confused surprise that suggested she genuinely hadn't considered the possibility that I might refuse to house Zoe again. "I mean that you've all just spent 10 minutes discussing arrangements for my home, my space, and my financial resources without once asking if I'm willing or able to provide housing for Zoe," I replied. Dad set down his fork with the careful precision of someone trying to maintain control of a situation that was starting to slip away from him. "Rebecca, of course we assumed you'd be willing to help your sister," he said, his voice carrying that parental authority tone that meant I was supposed to comply with family expectations rather than assert my own boundaries. "Why would you assume that?" I asked. "The last time Zoe stayed with me, she lived in my home for 4 months without contributing to rent, utilities, or groceries. She treated my condo like a free hotel while making no effort to find employment or move toward independence." The factual summary of Zoe's previous behavior was uncomfortable for everyone to hear stated so directly, because it contradicted the family narrative that portrayed her housing needs as temporary assistance rather than ongoing dependency. "That was different," Mom said quickly. "Zoe was going through a really difficult time then, and she needed extra support to get back on her feet." "How is this situation different?" I asked. "Zoe is unemployed, has no savings, and needs housing because she can't support herself independently. Those are exactly the same circumstances as 6 months ago." Zoe tried to jump in with her own defense. "Becca, I told you I've learned from my mistakes. I'll be more responsible this time, and I'll start contributing as soon as I find a job." "Zoe, you made identical promises 6 months ago, then proceeded to sleep until noon, use my streaming services, eat my food, and complain about my household management while contributing nothing to expenses or housework," I replied. The detailed recounting of her actual behavior was clearly uncomfortable for Zoe, but it was also necessary to establish the facts rather than allowing the family to operate on wishful thinking about her future performance. Besides, I continued, you've been living with Mom and Dad for 6 weeks. What efforts have you made during that time to find employment or save money for your own housing? The question hung in the air because everyone at the table knew the answer. Zoe had made minimal effort toward independence while living rent-free in our parents' home. Job hunting is really competitive right now, Zoe said defensively. And it's hard to stay motivated when you don't have your own space and privacy. So your plan is to move into my space and privacy instead? I asked. That's when Dad tried to reassert parental authority over the situation. Rebecca, this is about family helping family, he said, his voice carrying disapproval of my resistance to the family solution. Zoe needs support right now, and you're in a position to provide it. Dad, I'm in a position to provide support because I've made responsible choices about education, career, and finances, I replied. Zoe is in a position to need support because she's consistently made irresponsible choices that our family has consistently shielded her from experiencing consequences for. The direct statement about enabling patterns was clearly uncomfortable for our parents, but it was also the core issue that needed to be addressed. And every time the family volunteers my resources to solve problems Zoe has created, you're preventing her from learning to solve her own problems while expecting me to subsidize her irresponsibility. The room was completely silent now as the family processed my refusal to automatically comply with their solution to Zoe's housing crisis. But I had more to say, because this conversation was about much more than just housing arrangements. Since we're all here together, I said, walking to my purse and pulling out a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment, I think this is a good time to review the pattern of family decisions that have been made about my resources without my consent. The folder contained documentation I'd been collecting for over a year, records of every time our parents had volunteered my money, time, or space to solve family problems without asking my permission first. In the past 18 months, you've committed me to the following without consultation, I said, opening the folder and reading from my carefully compiled list. Providing Zoe with housing for 4 months, contributing $500 to her security deposit, lending her my car for 3 weeks when hers was repossessed, paying for her groceries during the time she lived with me, and covering her phone bill for 2 months when she claimed she couldn't afford it. This is where I need to pause and check in with all of you watching this family boundary breakdown. Have you ever kept track of how much money and resources your family has volunteered you to contribute to someone else's problems? Have you realized that saying no to family demands gets easier when you have documentation of how much you've already given? Hit that like button if you've ever had to create evidence to prove how much your family takes your generosity for granted. And subscribe because what I'm about to reveal about the total cost of being the family safety net will blow your mind. Trust me, the numbers alone are enough to justify every boundary I'm about to set. The total financial cost of these family decisions made without my consent is $11,400, I continued. Plus approximately 600 hours of my time spent managing Zoe's crises, transportation needs, and living arrangements. The specific numbers hit the table like physical objects. Our parents had never calculated the actual cost of their expectations that I serve as Zoe's safety net, and seeing it quantified in dollars and hours made the burden undeniable. But the bigger issue isn't the money, I said. The bigger issue is that every time you volunteer my resources to solve Zoe's problems, you're preventing her from experiencing the natural consequences of her choices while expecting me to subsidize her irresponsibility. Mom was staring at the folder like it contained evidence of war crimes rather than simple documentation of family financial arrangements. Rebecca, we never asked you to keep track of every dollar, she said, her voice defensive. Family members help each other without keeping score. You're right that family members help each other, I replied. But help should be voluntary, temporary, and designed to promote independence rather than ongoing dependency. I pulled out additional documentation showing Zoe's pattern of behavior over the past 3 years. Zoe has been fired from 7 jobs, evicted from 3 apartments, and has defaulted on multiple financial obligations, I said, showing them the timeline I'd created. And every time she faces consequences for these choices, our family steps in to prevent her from learning from her mistakes. The pattern was clear and damning when presented factually rather than discussed through the emotional lens our family typically used for Zoe's problems. Each time you bail her out, you teach her that irresponsible behavior will be rewarded with family support, I continued. And each time you volunteer my resources to provide that support, you teach me that my boundaries and consent don't matter when family needs are involved. Dad tried to interrupt with another appeal to family solidarity. Rebecca, we're not asking you to support Zoe permanently, he said. Just until she gets back on her feet. Dad, you said the exact same thing 6 months ago, 8 months ago, and a year ago, I replied. When exactly do you expect Zoe to stay on her feet instead of falling down again and expecting family rescue? The question forced our parents to confront the reality that their enabling pattern wasn't actually helping Zoe develop independence. It was teaching her that family resources would always be available to solve problems she created through her own poor choices. And more importantly, I said, preparing to deliver the ultimatum I'd been building toward, when do you expect to ask my permission before volunteering my home and money to solve family problems? The silence that followed was the sound of a family dynamic shifting permanently as I established boundaries that would force everyone to change their expectations about my role as the automatic solution to Zoe's crises. Here's what's going to happen, I said, closing the documentation folder and looking directly at each family member. Zoe is not moving into my condo. Not this week, not next month, and not just until she gets back on her feet. The finality in my voice made it clear that this wasn't a negotiation or a starting position for family discussion, it was a boundary that would not be compromised. Rebecca, you can't be serious, Mom said, her voice carrying genuine shock that I would refuse to provide housing for my sister. Where is Zoe supposed to live? That's not my problem to solve, I replied. Zoe is 30 years old. Housing herself is her responsibility, not mine. But she doesn't have any money for rent or deposits, Dad protested, as if Zoe's financial situation was something that had happened to her rather than the predictable result of her own choices. Then she needs to get a job and earn money like every other adult in America, I said. There are entry-level positions available that would provide income for housing expenses. Zoe had been silent during most of this confrontation, but now she tried her own emotional appeal. Becca, I can't afford my own place on minimum wage, she said, her voice carrying the victimized tone that usually succeeded in generating family sympathy. And I can't get a better job without stable housing for interviews and preparation. Zoe, you've been living with Mom and Dad rent-free for 6 weeks, I replied. That's stable housing. What job applications have you submitted during that time? The question highlighted the flaw in her argument. She'd already had stable housing and hadn't used it to secure employment, so moving that stable housing to my condo wouldn't change her behavior or outcomes. Job hunting is harder than it used to be, she said defensively. Then you need to work harder at job hunting, I replied. But you need to do that work from Mom and Dad's house, not mine. That's when our parents tried to shift the conversation toward guilt and family obligation. Rebecca, I'm very disappointed in your attitude toward your sister, Dad said, his voice carrying the parental disapproval that was supposed to make me reconsider my boundaries. This family has always supported each other through difficult times. Dad, this family has always supported Zoe through difficult times while expecting me to provide that support, I corrected. When I was struggling to establish my career, no one offered me free housing, financial assistance, or family bailouts. The comparison was uncomfortable but accurate. My path to independence had included working multiple jobs, living in cheap apartments, and managing my finances carefully because family rescue wasn't available for my problems. You were more capable of handling challenges independently, Mom said, apparently not realizing that her explanation proved my point about enabling. I was capable of handling challenges independently because I was required to handle them independently, I replied. Zoe hasn't developed those same capabilities because she's never been required to use them. I pulled out the final piece of documentation I'd prepared, a comparison of my financial progress versus Zoe's financial regression over the past 5 years. While I was building savings, establishing credit, and increasing my income through career advancement, Zoe was accumulating debt, damaging her credit, and decreasing her housing stability through poor choices, I said, showing them the parallel timelines. The difference isn't natural capability, it's experience with consequences. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Our parents' enabling had actively prevented Zoe from developing the skills and habits necessary for independent adult life. So here's my ultimatum, I said, preparing to establish the new family dynamic that would force everyone to change their expectations and behaviors. Zoe will not be living with me under any circumstances. If she needs housing, you can continue providing it, find her alternative arrangements, or she can secure her own housing through employment like every other adult. Rebecca, that's heartless, Mom said, tears starting to form as she processed that her reliable family solution was no longer available. It's not heartless, it's healthy boundaries, I replied. And there's more. I pulled out a final document that would establish the new terms for my participation in family financial arrangements. Going forward, any family decisions involving my time, money, or resources will require my explicit consent before they're made, I said. I will no longer accept being voluntold to solve family problems or being guilted into compliance with decisions made without my input. The comprehensive boundary setting was necessary to prevent our parents from simply waiting for this crisis to pass then reverting to their previous patterns of volunteering my resources for Zoe's problems. And if these boundaries aren't respected, I'll be reducing my participation in family activities until everyone can treat my consent and autonomy with appropriate respect. The threat was clear: continue treating me like a family resource to be allocated without permission, and lose access to me entirely. Our parents were staring at me like I'd just announced I was joining a cult or moving to another planet. The idea that I would set limits on family access to my resources was apparently incomprehensible to people who'd spent years treating my success as a solution to Zoe's failures. But Zoe's reaction was the most telling of all. Zoe's response to my ultimatum was swift and revealed exactly why our parents' enabling had been so destructive to her development as an independent adult. "This is unbelievable," she screamed, her voice rising to a pitch that suggested genuine panic rather than simple anger. "You're supposed to be my sister. You're supposed to help me when I need support." The entitlement was staggering. Zoe genuinely believed that my resources existed primarily to solve her problems, and my refusal to provide housing was a betrayal of family obligations rather than a reasonable boundary between adult siblings. "Becca, I can't believe you're being this selfish," she continued, tears streaming down her face in what might have been genuine emotion or calculated manipulation. "I would do anything for you if you needed help." "Zoe, when have I ever needed your help?" I asked. "When have you ever been in a position to offer assistance to anyone, including yourself?" The question highlighted the one-directional nature of our relationship and the absurdity of her claiming reciprocal support when she'd never actually been capable of providing it. "That's not fair," she sobbed. Just because I've had some bad luck doesn't mean I wouldn't help family if I could. This isn't bad luck, I replied. This is the predictable result of consistently poor choices combined with family enabling that prevents you from learning from mistakes. Our parents tried to intervene before the confrontation could escalate further. Girls, let's calm down and discuss this rationally, Mom said, apparently still hoping for a compromise that would solve Zoe's housing problem without requiring actual parenting decisions. There's nothing to discuss, I said. I've established my boundaries, and they're not negotiable. Dad made one final attempt to reassert parental authority over the situation. Rebecca, we're very disappointed in your refusal to help family, he said, his voice carrying the tone of final judgment that was supposed to make me reconsider my position. This isn't the daughter we raised. You're absolutely right, I replied. The daughter you raised would have said yes to housing Zoe again, would have subsidized her irresponsibility for another 4 months, and would have enabled her failure to launch for another year. I stood up to leave, making it clear that the conversation was over. But that daughter has learned that enabling isn't helping, that boundaries aren't selfish, and that family love doesn't require sacrificing your own financial security and mental health to solve problems other people created. As I gathered my things to leave, Zoe made one final desperate attempt to change my mind. Becca, please, she said, her voice breaking with what seemed like genuine desperation. I don't have anywhere else to go. Mom and Dad's house is too small, and I can't afford my own place. If you don't let me stay with you, I'll be homeless. The threat of homelessness was designed to generate guilt and override my boundaries through fear of catastrophic consequences. But I'd researched this scenario and was prepared with factual responses. Zoe, there are multiple transitional housing programs, women's shelters, and subsidized housing options in our area, I said, handing her a list I'd prepared. There are also employment assistance programs, job training opportunities, and financial counseling services that can help you develop independence. The practical alternatives to family enabling were extensive, but they required effort and accountability that Zoe had been avoiding through family bailouts. But those programs have requirements and expectations, she protested, apparently not realizing that her objection proved my point about enabling. Yes, they do, I agreed. Requirements and expectations are how adults learn to manage their lives responsibly. I kissed Mom and Dad goodbye, acknowledging that this confrontation had damaged our relationships but also establishing that their disapproval wouldn't change my boundaries. I love this family, I said as I headed toward the door, but love doesn't mean accepting unlimited financial and emotional responsibility for choices other people make. As I left, I could hear Zoe sobbing and our parents comforting her while discussing alternative solutions that didn't involve my resources or compliance with their expectations. Over the next several weeks, the family dynamics shifted exactly as I'd predicted. Our parents had to make actual parenting decisions about how to handle Zoe's housing and employment needs without using me as a safety net. Initially, they tried to guilt me into reconsidering through text messages, phone calls, and reports about how stressed and upset Zoe was without the security of knowing she could move in with me. But when it became clear that my boundaries were permanent rather than tactical, they began exploring the alternative resources I'd suggested and requiring Zoe to participate in job search activities and financial planning as conditions for continued housing at their home. The process was difficult for everyone, but it was also necessary for Zoe to finally begin developing the skills and habits required for independent adult life. 6 months later, our family relationships had improved significantly, though they were based on mutual respect and voluntary assistance rather than assumed entitlement to my resources. The transformation in our family dynamics over the 6 months following my ultimatum was both dramatic and necessary. Without me available as an automatic safety net, our parents were forced to confront the reality that their enabling patterns weren't helping Zoe develop independence, they were actively preventing it. The first major change was in how our parents approached Zoe's housing situation. Instead of immediately seeking another family solution, they established clear expectations for her continued residence in their home. She would apply for at least 5 jobs per week, attend financial counseling sessions, and contribute to household expenses through part-time employment within 30 days. The structure and accountability that had been missing from Zoe's life for years suddenly became non-negotiable when the family could no longer outsource consequences to me. Zoe's initial response was predictable: anger, manipulation attempts, and threats to leave if her parents didn't treat her more fairly. But when it became clear that leaving would mean accessing the transitional housing and employment assistance programs I'd researched rather than moving in with me, she began to accept the new requirements. Within 2 months, Zoe had secured part-time employment at a retail store. The job wasn't prestigious or high-paying, but it provided income and work experience that began building her resume and employment history. More importantly, earning her own money, even a small amount, began to shift Zoe's perspective on the value of financial independence and the effort required to maintain housing and basic living expenses. Our parents also had to learn new ways of providing support that promoted independence rather than dependency. Instead of giving Zoe money when she needed something, they helped her create budgets and savings plans that would allow her to purchase things with her own earnings. Instead of solving her logistical problems, they provided transportation to job interviews and employment services while requiring her to handle applications and follow-up communications independently. The most significant change was in family gatherings and conversations. Zoe's problems were no longer the central topic of every family interaction, and my resources were no longer assumed to be available for family problem-solving. When Zoe mentioned needing money for work clothes, the conversation focused on how she could allocate her earnings rather than which family member would provide financial assistance. When she expressed frustration about her living situation, the discussion centered on her timeline for saving money for her own apartment rather than alternative family housing arrangements. My relationship with our parents improved significantly once they understood that my boundaries weren't punishment or rejection, they were necessary limits that allowed me to maintain family relationships without resentment or financial strain. "Rebecca, I owe you an apology," Dad said during a family dinner about 4 months after our confrontation. "We were asking you to solve problems that weren't your responsibility while preventing Zoe from learning to solve her own problems." Mom added her own acknowledgement of how their expectations had been unfair to both Zoe and me. "We thought we were helping by making sure Zoe always had family support," she said. "But we realize now that we were actually helping her avoid growing up and learning independence." The recognition was important, but the behavioral changes were more significant. Our parents began asking for my input before making family plans, respecting my decisions about my own time and resources, and treating my success as something to be celebrated rather than something to be leveraged for family problem-solving. Zoe and my relationship took longer to rebuild, but it ultimately became more genuine and balanced. Once she was no longer dependent on family bailouts, she could interact with me as a sister rather than as a source of emergency assistance. "Becca, I need to thank you," she said during a private conversation about 8 months after the ultimatum. "I was really angry at you for not letting me move in, but I realize now that you were the only one treating me like an adult who could solve her own problems." She'd been promoted to assistant manager at her retail job, had moved into a small apartment with a roommate, and was taking community college classes to develop additional job skills. All achievements that had been impossible when family enabling prevented her from experiencing consequences and building capabilities. "I always knew you guys would rescue me if things got too hard," she admitted. "So I never really tried to make things work on my own." Today, 2 years later, our family relationships are healthier and more sustainable than they've ever been. Zoe supports herself independently, our parents provide emotional support without financial enabling, and I participate in family activities without fear that my resources will be voluntold for crisis management. The most important lesson from this experience was learning that saying no to family demands isn't selfish. It's often the most loving thing you can do for people who need to develop their own capabilities and independence. Now I want to ask all of you who followed this journey from family doormat to boundary setting success. Have you ever had to document how much your family was taking advantage of your generosity before you could justify saying no? What does it look like to love family members while refusing to enable their dysfunction? How do you handle the guilt and pressure that comes with being the first person to establish healthy boundaries in an unhealthy family system? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear from others who've had to choose between family approval and personal financial security, or who've discovered that helping family members sometimes means refusing to help them avoid consequences. Hit that like button if this story resonated with your own experiences of being the family safety net who finally learned to say no, and subscribe for more real-life stories where setting boundaries leads to healthier relationships and genuine family growth. Share this video with anyone who needs to remember that family love doesn't require unlimited financial sacrifice, that enabling isn't helping, and that sometimes the best thing you can do for irresponsible family members is refuse to rescue them from the natural consequences of their choices. Thank you for joining me on this journey from automatic compliance to empowered boundary setting. Remember that your resources are not family property, that consent matters even with relatives, and that true family support helps people become independent rather than keeping them dependent. Until next time, may your family relationships be built on mutual respect rather than assumed obligation, and may you always have the courage to say I haven't agreed to that when people try to volunteer your resources without your permission.